a dying town, a widow with a gun, a debt she can't pay, and 60 days before everything she built gets ripped from her hands. Then, at midnight, in the middle of a Texas thunderstorm, the most silent man in the county shows up on her porch, soaked in blood, down on one knee, begging her to hide the one person who can bring down a governor. She could have shut the door. She could have saved herself. Instead, Martha Hayes made a choice that put a target on her back, a girl in her cellar, and a dangerous, broken man under her roof. What happens next will test every limit of courage, loyalty, and justice in a land where the law belongs to the highest bidder. This is the story of two people who survived by refusing to break, and what they built when they finally stopped fighting alone. If this story grabbed you, hit that like button, drop a comment, share it with someone who needs to hear it today, and subscribe, because stories like this one are waiting for you every single week.
Redemption Creek was dying, slow and ugly. The railroad had cut north 2 years ago. The money followed the tracks. What was left behind was red dust, rotting wood, and folks too stubborn to pack up. Martha Mattie Hayes was the most stubborn of them all. It was a cold September morning. Mattie stood alone by the wash basin in the back room of her way station. She held one end of a cotton strip in her teeth. Her right hand pulled it tight over her left forearm. A rusted roofing nail had torn her flesh the day before. She didn't cry out when it happened. She didn't flinch now. Blood seeped through the white cloth. She just tied the knot tighter. Pain was a familiar guest at Hayes' way station. You acknowledge it, but you don't let it free. She wouldn't ask the town doctor for help. She couldn't afford to, and she wouldn't take his charity. Pity always costs more than coin. You let people pity you. You let them own a piece of you. Folks in town called her the woman made of wire. Behind her back, of course. Wire bends, they thought. But Mattie didn't bend. She survived. Right now, survival had a price tag, $340. The bank had given her 60 days. If she didn't have the cash, the bank manager's wife would see her tossed into the dirt. It wasn't just business. It was cruel, petty vengeance against a woman who refused to know her proper place. The trap was set. The jaws were closing. Midnight brought the storm. A Texas thunderstorm doesn't just rain. It assaults the earth. The wind howled against the roof of the way station. Thunder shook the floorboards. Then a different sound. Thud, thud, thud. Heavy, frantic. Fist hammering against her heavy oak front door. Mattie didn't hesitate. She reached under the front counter. Her fingers curled around the worn wooden grip of her old Civil War-era Colt revolver. She kept the barrel pointed at the floor. She unbolted the lock and pulled the door open. Lightning flashed. It painted the porch in cold, harsh white. Silas Montgomery stood there, the silent cowboy, the legend of Redemption Creek. In the 3 years he had lived out at his small ranch, Mattie had heard him speak maybe 2 full sentences. He was a man made of granite and cold stares, a man who never bowed his head, a man who never asked for a damn thing from anyone. Tonight he was drenched to the bone. Rain ran down his sharp jaw. Blood dripped heavily from his bruised knuckles, mixing with the puddles at his boots. But it wasn't the blood that caught Mattie's eye. It was what stood behind him. A girl, 17 at most, Clara. She was half hidden in Silas' shadow, clutching his heavy coat. She was shaking like a leaf caught in a gale. Her eyes were wide, terribly wide. It wasn't just fear in those eyes. It was pure, unadulterated terror. The kind of terror you only get when you see the devil working in plain sight. Then the unthinkable happened. Silas Montgomery, the proudest man in the county, didn't stand tall. He didn't demand shelter. He stepped over the threshold and dropped. One knee hit the wet floorboards with a heavy thud. He looked up at Mattie. The cold granite in his eyes was gone, stripped away, left raw and desperate. He looked like a man watching his world burn, willing to throw himself into the fire to save the only thing that mattered. "Hide my sister," he begged. His voice was rough, scraped, hollow. Mattie froze. The wind whipped rain onto her face. Her mind raced. This was trouble. Big trouble. The kind of trouble that leaves no survivors. The smart thing, the safe thing, was to shut the door, lock it, turn a blind eye. She looked at the trembling girl. She looked at the blood on Silas's hands. He was offering up his dignity, completely and utterly, to shield someone weaker. Mattie looked down at the gun in her hand. She slowly uncocked the hammer. She laid the weapon down on the nearest table. She didn't ask who was chasing them. She didn't ask why. "Get up," Mattie said. Her voice cut through the thunder, calm and steady. Silas hesitated, confusion flashing across his wet face. Mattie stepped aside and pulled the door wide open. She looked him dead in the eye. "My floor isn't meant for people on their knees," she said, her tone leaving absolutely no room for debate. "A person's worth isn't measured by how low they can bow, Montgomery. No matter who is chasing you, you don't lose your dignity in this house. Walk in here on your own 2 feet. Both of you." Silas stared at her. A muscle twitched in his jaw. Slowly, he stood up. He pulled his sister inside. Maddie slammed the door shut, throwing the heavy iron bolt into place, locking the storm and whatever hell was following it outside for now. The heavy iron bolt slid home with a definitive thud. It sounded like a judge gavel final. Inside the way station, the silence was thicker than the storm outside. The only sound was the dripping of rainwater from Silas' coat hitting the floorboards. Maddie didn't offer them a seat. She walked straight to the cast iron stove. She stirred the dying embers, threw in a chunk of mesquite, and shoved the coffee pot over the heat. Action over panic. That was her rule. Panic got people killed. Coffee bought them time to think. Talk, Maddie said. She kept her back to them. Silas stood rigid. He kept himself positioned between his sister and the door, like a human shield. Josiah Sterling, Silas said. 2 words. They were enough to chill the room faster than the September wind. Sterling was the governor, a man with a polite smile and a heart made of cold, hard cash. What about him? Maddie turned, leaning against the counter. Silas swallowed hard. He wasn't used to speaking. The words seemed to scrape against his throat. Sterling wants the valley, all of it, for the new railroad spur. Elias Thorne owned the riverbend. He wouldn't sell. Maddie knew old Elias, a stubborn, decent man. So, Sterling's men visited him tonight. 4 of them, Silas said. His voice was completely flat, dead. That lack of emotion was terrifying. They didn't come to negotiate. They came to make an example. Clara let out a small, jagged breath. She squeezed her eyes shut. They shot him, Silas finished. Left him in the mud. Maddie looked at the girl, and she saw it. Silas nodded once. She was bringing Elias a basket of late apples she hid in the brush, but they heard her run. The coffee began to hiss on the stove. Maddie didn't move to pour it. She stared at Silas. She was weighing the man, measuring the desperation against the danger. If the governor's men were hunting this girl, hiding her wasn't just risky. It was a death sentence if they were caught. Silas reached into his wet coat. His hand emerged holding a thick leather pouch and a folded piece of heavy parchment. He stepped forward and placed them on the wooden counter. The pouch clinked. Heavy. $340, Silas said. Maddie's eyes narrowed. That was exactly what she owed the bank, to the penny. Silas didn't explain how he knew. In a town, this small misery always found an audience. It is everything I have, Silas continued. He tapped the folded parchment. And this is the deed to the Montgomery Ranch. 600 acres, good water. It's yours. Maddie looked at the small fortune on her counter. For 3 years, Silas had broken his back to build that ranch. He had fenced it, bled for it, starved for it. It was his pride. Now he was pushing it across table, like a pile of worthless chips. Implicit value. True devotion isn't spoken. It's measured by what a person is willing to lose without a second thought to protect the vulnerable. Take it, Silas said. Pay the bank. Keep the land. Just hide her. Put her in the cellar. Keep her out of sight until I can find a way to get her out of the state. Maddie didn't touch the money. She didn't touch the deed. She looked past Silas, right at Clara. The girl was soaked, trembling. But when Clara opened her eyes, Maddie saw a spark in them. It wasn't just fear. It was comprehension. Clara stepped out from behind her brother's broad back. She reached into her grip pocket. Her fingers were shaking, but her grip was tight. She pulled out a crumpled piece of paper. It was stained with rain and dirt. They dropped this, Clara said. Her voice was thin, but it didn't break. When they were dragging Mr. Thorne out, the man in the fine coat dropped it from his saddlebag. She placed it on the counter, next to the gold. Maddie leaned in. She recognized the thick, expensive stationery immediately. It was the governor's seal. Below it, written in sharp, elegant handwriting, was an order. Remove the Thorne obstacle permanently, signed J. Sterling. The breath hitched in Maddie's chest. This wasn't just a murder. This was an execution by the state. And the girl had the rope to hang the governor. No wonder they were hunting her. Silas looked at the paper. Then he looked at Maddie. I'm leaving. I'll ride south. I'll leave a trail a blind man could follow. They'll think she's with me. They'll chase me. They'll kill you, Silas, Maddie said plainly. Let them try, he replied. He tapped the deed again. We have a deal? Maddie stared at the deed. It represented her freedom, her safety, her victory over the bank manager's wife. It was everything she had been fighting for, handed to her on a silver platter. She reached out. Her fingers brushed the heavy parchment. Then she picked it up, folded it in half, and shoved it hard into Silas' chest. Silas stumbled back a half step, shocked. Keep your land, Montgomery, Maddie said. Her voice was steel. She was absolutely resolutely clear. I'm not a mercenary, and I'm not a bank. Maddie, please, shut up and listen. She pointed a finger at the gold, then at Clara. A human life isn't priced in acres. It's not weighed in gold. You don't buy a person's safety. Not in my house. I will hide her, Maddie continued, holding Silas's gaze. I will hide her because she is an innocent girl hunted by cowards. I will do it because she deserves to live. Not because you are buying my conscience. Do you understand? Les stared at her for a long moment. The silence returned. But it wasn't the heavy, suffocating silence of before. It was the silence of a man encountering something entirely unbreakable. He slowly pocketed the deed. He left the gold. "For the bank," he said quietly. "Alone, between equals." Maddie didn't argue. Silas turned to Clara. He didn't hug her. He simply gripped her shoulder, a firm, grounding pressure. "Stay quiet. Listen to her." Clara nodded, tears spilling over her cheeks. Silas walked to the door. He didn't look back. He opened it, stepped into the howling storm, and pulled the door shut behind him. Maddie watched the door. She knew what he was doing. He was walking into the dark to draw the wolves away, a silent man shouting with his actions. She turned to Clara. "Take off that wet dress, child. We have work to do before the sun comes up." Morning broke like a bruised eye. The sky was a swollen purplish gray. The storm had passed, leaving behind a thick, humid heat and a sea of red mud. Inside Hayes Way Station, the world had fundamentally shifted. Clara Montgomery was gone. In her place stood a new maid. Maddie had given her a faded, oversized cotton dress and a heavy canvas apron. Her hair, usually worn in loose curls, was pulled back tightly and pinned flat against her scalp. She had dirt rubbed into her knuckles and flour dusted on her cheek. "Your name is Mary," Maddie told her over breakfast. "You my cousin S-girl from up near Dallas. You're quiet. You work hard. You don't look strangers in the eye. You understand?" "Yes, ma'am," Clara said. "Good, grab the lye soap. The floors won't scrub themselves." It wasn't cruelty. It was survival. Panic and idleness were a deadly combination. Work kept the mind tethered to the earth. By 9 o'clock, the town began to wake. Wagons rolled through the mud. The usual cast of characters drifted past the way station. Maddie kept her eyes sharp, watching the road. Around 10, a wagon pulled up. Maddie's hand instinctively drifted toward the counter. But it wasn't the governor's men. It was Silas. He didn't look like a man on the run. He looked exhausted, muddy, but entirely calm. He tied his horse to the post, pulled a heavy toolbox from the wagon bed, and walked into the way station. Maddie met him at the door. "I thought you were riding south." "I did," Silas said quietly, not looking at her. "Left my hat and a lame horse down by the river crossing. Made it look like I tried to ford it in the dark and got swept away. They'll drag the river for a week." He walked past her, setting his toolbox down near the back door. "What are you doing here, Silas?" "Working." He opened the box. He pulled out a hammer and a handful of long iron nails. "I owe you." "Clara stays. I work. People know I'm tight with $1. They'll believe I'm working off her room and board instead of paying cash." It was a brilliant, simple cover. The town knew Silas as a hard, practical man. Trading labor for a relative's lodging fit his reputation perfectly. Without waiting for an answer, Silas walked out the back door. 5 minutes later, Maddie heard the rhythmic, steady thwack of his hammer hitting the roof. He was fixing the rotting cedar shingles she had been trying to patch herself when she cut her arm. For the next 3 days, a strange rhythm settled over the way station. Silas arrived at dawn. He spoke to no one. He fixed the roof. He reinforced the corral fences. He chopped enough firewood to last through the winter. He took his meals on the back porch, alone. Clara now, Mary worked inside. She washed, she swept, she served the few travelers who stopped for a meal. But in the late afternoons, when the station was empty, she would sit at the kitchen table. She didn't knit, she didn't rest. She read. From her small satchel, she had produced a thick, leather-bound book, Commentaries on the Laws of England. It was an old volume, brought over from St. Louis by Silas years ago. Maddie was chopping onions for stew one afternoon when Clara looked up from the dense yellowed pages. "Mrs. Hayes?" Clara asked softly. "Maddie, and keep your voice down," Maddie replied, not looking up from the knife. "Maddie," Clara corrected herself. She ran her hand over the page. "I'm reading about the rights of the common man, about due process, about how no man should arbitrarily take a life or property." Maddie snorted, a bitter, short sound. "Paper is patient, Clara. You can write anything on it." Clara frowned. She looked at the crumpled, blood-stained execution order hidden carefully under the floorboards beneath her chair. "But if it's the law, shouldn't it protect people? Shouldn't it protect someone like Elias Thorne? He was just a farmer. Why did the law let him die?" Maddie stopped chopping. She laid the knife down. She wiped her hands on her apron and turned to look at the 17-year-old girl. The innocence in Clara's question was heavy. It was the kind of innocence that usually got people killed in this part of the country. Maddie pulled out a chair and sat across from her. "Listen to me, Clara," Maddie said, her voice dropping to a low, intense register. "The law is a tool, just like Silas's hammer out there. In the hands of a builder, a hammer makes a home. In the hands of a thug, it crushes a skull. The tool doesn't care." Clara looked down at the book. "So it's useless." "I didn't say that." Maddie reached out and tapped the leather cover of the book. "Laws on paper can't stop bullets. They won't make a corrupt man like Governor Sterling suddenly grow a conscience. They won't magically shield the poor from the greedy." Maddie leaned closer. "But they are the only boundary separating us from wild animals. The law is a promise we make to each other. It's the standard. If we stop believing in our right to fair treatment, if we say, the rich always win, so why bother? Then we've killed ourselves before the enemy even pulls the trigger. Clara's eyes widened slightly. You're saying the law only works if we force it to work. Exactly, Maddie nodded. Sterling uses the law to justify stealing land. We have to use the law to hang him for it. But to do that, you can't just know the words. You have to have the spine to stand behind them when the guns are drawn. Do you understand? Clara looked at the door leading to the back porch. The rhythmic sound of Silas' hammer echoed through the walls. Her brother was out there, sweating, pretending to be a simple laborer, hiding in plain sight to protect her. Clara looked back at Maddie, her jaw set. The trembling girl from the storm was slowly hardening into something else. I understand, Clara said. She opened the book again. She didn't read it like a student anymore. She read it like a soldier memorizing a map of the battlefield. Outside, the hammering continued. Steady, relentless, a quiet promise that as long as the roof held, they would fight the storm together. The tension in Redemption Creek didn't arrive with a shout. It settled in like a bad fever, slow, heavy, suffocating. Strangers rode into town, men with hard eyes and low-slung holsters. They didn't buy supplies. They didn't look for work. They sat on the boardwalks. They chewed tobacco. They watched. They were Governor Sterling's hounds, sniffing the dirt for a frightened 17-year-old girl. Inside the way station, the air was thick enough to cut with a hunting knife. Maddie kept the coffee hot and the doors open. Business as usual. That was the trick to hiding. You don't cower in the dark. You stand in the light and act like you belong there. Clara played her part. She scrubbed the floors until her knuckles bled. She kept her chin tucked. When the hard-eyed men came in for a meal, she served them silently. She was just Mary, a shadow with a serving tray. And Silas worked. He didn't just fix the roof. He rebuilt the front steps. He rehung the heavy oak doors so they closed flush against the frame. He was fortifying the building, turning a wooden way station into a fortress nail by nail. He and Maddie barely spoke. They didn't need to. Words were clumsy. Words could be overheard. Instead, they developed a language of movement. If Maddie left a fresh cup of black coffee on the porch rail, it meant the dining room was clear. If Silas left his hammer resting on the chopping block instead of in his toolbox, it meant he had spotted one of the hounds circling out back. It was a delicate, dangerous dance, and they moved in perfect step. The real test came on a Tuesday night. It had been unseasonably hot. The air was dead. Around midnight, dry lightning began to spiderweb across the black sky. No rain, just heat and electricity. Maddie was awake. She always slept light these days. A sharp, violent crack of thunder rattled the window panes. A second later, a horrific sound tore through the night. Wood splintering, iron ringing, and the frantic, terrified scream of a horse. Maddie threw off her quilt. She shoved her bare feet into her leather boots, grabbed her lantern, and sprinted out the back door. It was her roan gelding Buster. A rattlesnake, flushed out by the heat, had slithered into the corral. The lightning strike had spooked them both. Buster was a big horse, 1,200 of pure muscle and panic. He was rearing up, thrashing wildly, his iron-shod hooves smashed against the cedar fencing. He was going to break his own legs, or break out and run blind into the dark. Maddie hit the dirt of the corral. She raised the lantern. "Buster, easy, easy, boy," she yelled. The horse didn't hear her. He spun, his eyes rolling white in the lantern light. He kicked out, shattering a top rail. Splinters flew like shrapnel. Maddie stepped forward. It was a stupid move. A panicked horse will kill you without meaning to. A stray hoof to the skull, and you're dead in the dirt. But she couldn't afford to lose him. Not now. Before she could take another step, a shadow detached itself from the side of the barn. Silas. He slept in the hayloft to keep watch. He was barefoot, wearing only his trousers and an undershirt. He didn't shout. He didn't run. He moved with a terrifying, deliberate calm. He flanked the horse from the blind side. Maddie instantly understood. She held her ground, keeping the lantern raised, drawing the horse's frantic attention forward. "Keep the light steady," Silas grunted. His voice was a low rumble. Maddie didn't nod. She just locked her arms, holding the beam dead center on the horse's chest. Buster reared again, pawing at the sky. As he came down, Silas stepped in. He didn't try to muscle the animal. That was impossible. Instead, he moved with the horse's downward momentum. His large hand shot out, grabbing the leather halter just below the jaw. The horse violently jerked its head up, lifting Silas completely off his feet. Maddie's breath hitched. But Silas didn't let go. He hung his dead weight on the halter. He didn't fight the horse's strength. He became an anchor to it. As gravity pulled Silas down, it brought the horse head down with him. The moment Buster's hooves hit the dirt, Maddie moved. She stepped in on the opposite side. She didn't hesitate. She trusted Silas to hold the head. She ran her hand firmly along the horse's quivering neck, strong, even strokes. "I got you," Maddie murmured. Not to the horse. To say no. Silas breathed heavily. His boots finding purchase in the dirt, they stood there for 10 minutes. A widow and a silent cowboy flanking a 1,200-pound beast in the dead of night. They moved in absolute synchronization. When the horse shifted left, Silas yielded a bare inch, and Maddie pressed firmly to compensate. When it lunged right, they reversed the pressure. It was a masterclass in balance. Slowly, the frantic whites of the horse's eyes receded. The heavy, panicked snorting turned into rhythmic blowing. The trembling stopped, the danger passed. Maddie lowered the lantern. Silas let go of the halter. They stood in the dark, chests heaving. The smell of ozone, sweat, and dust hung heavy in the air. Silas looked down. Maddie followed his gaze. When the top rail had splintered, a jagged piece of cedar had slashed across Silas' bare shoulder. Blood was running down his arm in a thick, dark line. Maddie looked at it. Then she looked up at his face. He wasn't wincing. He was just looking at her.
"You're bleeding,"
She said, quietly plied. So are you, Silas replied. Maddie looked down at her own hand. The friction of the rough leather halter had torn open the skin, and even felt it. They stood there in the muddy corral. No thank yous, no dramatic gasps. They had faced a sudden, chaotic violence. They had stepped into the danger together without a single word of planning, and they had held the line. I'll get the iodine, Maddie said. Silas gave a single nod. He turned to lead the horse back to its stall. It was a small victory, but as Maddie walked back to the way station, she felt a profound shift in the ground beneath her feet. She was no longer standing alone. The devil didn't arrive in a cloud of brimstone. He arrived in a gilded carriage with velvet seats. Governor Josiah Sterling rolled into Redemption Creek on a Thursday afternoon. The town practically bent over backward. The corrupt mayor polished his badge. The cowardly sheriff cleared the streets. Sterling was here for an official inspection of the county. Everyone knew it was a lie. He was hunting. Maddie watched through the front window. Sterling stepped out of his carriage. He was a handsome man in his 50s, silver hair, tailored wool suit that cost more than most men in this town would earn in a lifetime. He was the embodiment of polite cruelty. He didn't scream or threaten. He smiled. He shook hands. He handed out crisp dollar bills to the ragged children playing in the dirt. He bought the loyalty of the desperate with spare change. He's coming here, Silas said. He was standing in the shadows near the kitchen door, a hammer gripped loosely in his fist. I know, Maddie said. She smoothed her apron. She looked back at Clara. The girl was pale, scrubbing a cast-iron skillet with shaking hands. Mary, you keep your eyes on that pan. If he speaks to you, you answer short, and you sound stupid. Go. The brass bell above the door jingled. Governor Sterling walked in. He was flanked by two large men in suits. Hounds. Good afternoon, Sterling said. His voice was smooth, cultured. It belonged in a Houston ballroom, not a dusty way station. Mrs. Hayes, I presume? Governor, Mattie said. She didn't smile. She didn't offer her hand. She stood behind her counter, her territory. Sterling didn't seem to mind the chill. He looked around the room, taking in the freshly repaired walls, the clean floors. His eyes bag of a yak kitchen girl scrubbing a pan. I see you run a tight establishment, Mrs. Hayes. Commendable. Sterling walked slowly toward the counter. The mayor tells me you're taking a new girl recently, a relative. Cousin's girl, from Dallas, Maddie said smoothly. Not a flinch, not a blink. Ah, Dallas. Sterling smiled. His eyes were like chips of flint, cold, dead. It's a dangerous world out there for a young woman traveling alone. People go missing every day. Runaways, witnesses to terrible accidents. It is our civic duty to keep an eye out for the lost. Wouldn't you agree? I don't know much about politics, Governor. I just serve coffee and mind my business, a wise philosophy. Sterling reached into his tailored pocket. He pulled out a crisp, brand-new $50 bill. He placed it softly on the wooden counter. $50, a staggering amount of money. I am a generous man, Mrs. Hayes, Sterling said softly. If you, or your cousin from Dallas, were to remember seeing anyone passing through, anyone who shouldn't be here, there would be substantially more where that came from. Maddie looked at the money. Then she looked up at Sterling. I'll keep that in mind. Would you like a cup of coffee, Governor? Or just the floor space? Sterling's smile tightened. Just a fraction. He recognized iron when he struck it. He tapped the counter twice, turned on his heel, and walked out. The hounds followed. Maddie exhaled a breath she didn't know she was holding. But the devil is persistent, and he doesn't like to lose. Midnight, the way station was dark. Maddie was wiping down the front counter, doing inventory by the light of a single oil lamp. The silence of the town was heavy again. A floorboard creaked on the front porch. Maddie didn't stop wiping the counter. Her right hand slipped under her apron, resting on the cold steel of her Colt revolver, tucked into her waistband. The lock on the front door clicked. Someone had picked it, expertly. The door swung open. A man stepped inside. It was one of Sterling's hounds, the bigger one. His name was Vance. He closed the door behind him and leaned against it. He drew a long, heavy Bowie knife from his belt. The blade caught the lamplight. "Evening, widow," Vance whispered. He grinned, a predatory, ugly thing. Maddie didn't scream. She didn't back away. She kept her left hand on the cleaning rag. "The governor closed the bank, Vance. Come back tomorrow," Maddie said. Her voice was bored. Vance chuckled. He stepped away from the door, moving slowly toward the counter. "The governor thinks you're hiding something. He thinks you're a stubborn, foolish woman who needs a little persuasion. He sent me to have a private chat with you. And your little maid." He took another step. He raised the knife. "I'm going to ask you once, widow. Where is she?" "Stop right there," Maddie said. Vance laughed. He took another step. "Or what? You going to hit me with a broom?" He lunged. He expected a scream. He expected her to turn and run. He didn't expect the blur of motion. Maddie didn't retreat. She pivoted on her heel, dropping the rag. Her right hand whipped out from beneath her apron. Click-clack. The sound of a heavy hammer being cocked back echoed like a cannon shot in the quiet room. Vance froze. The barrel of a .44 caliber Colt revolver was pressed directly against the bridge of his nose. The metal was cold. The hand holding it was completely, terrifyingly steady. Maddie's eyes had changed. The tired widow was gone. Staring down the barrel of that gun was a ghost from the Civil War, a woman who had seen more blood and death than this street thug could ever comprehend. "Drop the knife," Maddie said. It wasn't a request. Vance swallowed hard. His eyes crossed, staring at the black hole of the barrel. The knife clattered to the floorboards. "You don't have the stomach to pull that trigger, lady," Vance sneered, though his voice shook. Maddie leaned in just a fraction. "My name is Martha Hayes," she said, her voice dropping to a deadly, even whisper. "In 1864, I rode with the Union Intelligence Corps. I didn't just bandage boys up. I extracted information from Confederate spies. I have patched up thousands of bullet holes. I know the anatomy of a man better than God does." She pressed the barrel a millimeter harder against his skin. "I know exactly where to shoot you so that you don't die. I can put a bullet through your spine that will leave you breathing, awake, and paralyzed from the neck down for the next 40 years. You will spend the rest of your life breathing through a tube and staring at a ceiling, feeding on soup through a straw." Vance began to tremble. Sweat beaded on his forehead. He realized with absolute certainty that this woman was not bluffing. She was doing the math in her head. "Now," Maddie whispered, "back out that door. Tell your governor that Hayesville Station is closed to his kind of business. If you ever set foot on my porch again, I won't kill you. I will ruin you. Get out." She stepped back, keeping the gun leveled at his face. Vance scrambled backward. He fumbled for the doorknob, ripped the door open, and bolted into the night. Maddie stood in the quiet room for a long moment. She slowly uncocked the hammer. Her hand didn't shake. "You should have killed him." Maddie turned. Silas stepped out from the shadows of the hallway. He had his own Winchester rifle in his hands. He had been there the whole time. He had watched it all, ready to step in. But he hadn't, because he saw that she had it under control. He lowered the rifle. He looked at her with a profound, newfound reverence. "If he comes back, he won't come alone," Silas said. "A dead man can't talk. A dead man can't threaten." Maddie walked to the counter. She laid the Colt down. She looked at Silas. "Killing is easy, Silas," Maddie said heavily. "It's the easiest thing in the world to pull a trigger when you're scared or angry." She rested her hands on the wood. "Sterling kills people because they are in his way. He treats human life like an obstacle, like dirt to be swept aside. If I shoot that man in cold blood just because it makes my life safer, how am I any different than the governor?" Silas frowned. "It's self-defense. It's execution." Maddie corrected him sharply. "I disarmed him. The threat was over. Human rights begin with not taking a life if there is another choice. A murderer might be cowardly, Silas, but I am not allowed to let them turn me into one. If we abandon our humanity just to survive, then whatever is left standing isn't worth saving anyway." Silas stared at her. In a lawless land where blood paid for blood, her morality was a radical, staggering thing. He didn't argue. He looked at the gun on the counter, then at the fierce, unwavering woman who wielded it. He gave a slow, deep nod of absolute respect. "I'll take the first watch," Silas said quietly. He turned and walked out to the porch, standing guard in the dark, protecting a woman who had just proven she didn't need a savior but who deserved a partner. The night was hot, unnaturally hot for late September. The air hung thick and heavy, tasting of red dust and bad intentions. Heat makes men mean, money makes them bold. Governor Sterling had brought plenty of both to Redemption Creek. It started just past 10 o'clock. Maddie was wiping down the tables. Clara was safely tucked away in the root cellar, reading her law book by the light of a single shielded candle. Outside, boots crunched heavily on the gravel, loud voices, the clinking of glass bottles. 4 men. They weren't Sterling's hired professionals, not the suited hounds. These were local drunks, men with empty lives and newly full pockets. Sterling had tossed them some silver, pointed them toward the way station, and told them to make some noise, to rattle the widow's cage, to see what shook loose. They stomped onto the front porch. One of them kicked a wooden chair. It shattered against the siding. "Hey, widow!" a voice bellowed, slurred and ugly. "Governor says you're hiding strays. Bring 'em out." Inside, Maddie didn't reach for her Colt. Not yet. A gun changes the math of a situation immediately and usually permanently. She walked to the window. Before she could unlatch the shutters, a shadow stepped out from the side of the building. Silas. He didn't carry his Winchester. He didn't have his revolver drawn. He just walked up the steps, his hands hanging loose at his sides. He stepped between the four men and the front door. "Station's closed," Silas said. His voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It cut through the drunken laughter like an axe blade through soft pine. The leader of the group, a heavy-set man with a tangled beard, spat on the floorboards. "This ain't your fight, Montgomery. Step aside. We got business with the lady." "Station's closed," Silas repeated. The big man swung. It was a sloppy, looping punch fueled by cheap rye whiskey. Silas didn't even blink. He stepped inside the arc of the heavy fist. He drove his own palm hard upward, catching the man under the chin. Teeth clacked together. The man's eyes rolled back, and he dropped like a felled oak. The other three surged forward. Maddie watched through the glass. Her breath caught, but her hand stayed off her gun. She understood exactly what Silas was doing. The fight was ugly, fast, brutal. Silas moved with a terrifying efficiency. He blocked a wild swing, twisted a wrist until the bone popped, and shoved the second man off the edge of the porch into the dirt. The third man scrambled backward, his courage vanishing. But the fourth man was fast, and he wasn't completely drunk. He lunged from Silas' blind side. Moonlight flashed off a jagged piece of steel, a hunting knife. Silas turned, but he was a fraction of a second too late. He threw his left arm up to protect his neck. The blade sliced through his heavy canvas shirt. It bit deep into the meat of his forearm. Silas didn't cry out. He didn't stagger. He clamped his right hand over the man's knife wrist. He twisted, hard and vicious. The man screamed, dropping the blade. Silas stepped in and delivered a short, brutal strike to the man's ribs. The attacker collapsed, gasping for air that wouldn't come. Silas stood on the porch. He was breathing heavily. Blood dripped steadily from his left arm, pattering against the wooden floorboards. He looked down at the men groaning in the dirt. "Go home," Silas said. They didn't need to be told twice. They grabbed their bruised ribs and broken pride, dragging their unconscious friend away into the dark. The porch went quiet. The front door opened. Maddie stood there. She looked at the blood pooling at his boots. She didn't fuss. She didn't gasp. "Kitchen," Maddie said. Now, the kitchen was warm. It smelled of dried sage and old wood smoke. Silas sat in a heavy wooden chair at the table. He had stripped off his ruined shirt. His chest was corded muscle, marked by old faded scars. But the new wound on his forearm was ugly. It was deep, jagged, and bleeding freely. Maddie set a tin basin on the table. She poured steaming water from the stove kettle into it. She added a splash of sharp-smelling carbolic acid. She laid out a clean rag, a needle, and a spool of black gut thread. "Hold still," she said. She took his arm. Her hands were incredibly gentle, yet completely firm. She didn't hesitate. She plunged the rag into the hot, stinging water and pressed it directly into the open cut to clean out the dirt and fabric fibers. Silas' jaw clenched tight. The muscles in his neck stood out like steel cables. But he didn't pull away. He didn't make a sound. "Breathe, Silas," Maddie murmured. She kept her eyes on the wound. "You hold your breath. Your heart beats harder. You bleed faster. Breathe." Silas let out a long, ragged exhale. Maddie worked with a rhythmic, practiced grace. Wash, wipe, assess. She picked up the needle. She held it to the flame of the oil lamp until the tip glowed red hot, killing the invisible poison. "This is going to bite," he warned. "Do it," Silas grunted. She pierced the skin, pulled the heavy thread through, tied a knot. For a long time, the only sound in the kitchen was the hiss of the lamp and the soft, wet sound of the thread pulling through skin. "You didn't draw your gun," Maddie said softly, tying the fourth stitch. "Neither did you. I was watching from the window. I had it in my hand." Maddie snipped the thread with a small pair of iron scissors. "You could have shot them, Silas. No jury in Texas would have convicted you. 4 men trespassing, attacking a man on a porch. You had the right." "Having the right doesn't make it right," Silas said. His voice was a low rumble in the quiet room. "I'm tired of dead bodies, Maddie. Sterling wants a war. If I shoot 4 local idiots in your front yard, I give him exactly what he wants. He brings the federal marshals. He brings the army. He burns this place to the ground legally." Maddie started on the 5th stitch. "So you took a knife to the arm instead. It's just blood. It's your blood." Maddie looked up from his arm. Her eyes met his, fierce, searching. "You throw yourself in front of horses. You throw yourself in front of knives. You give away your land. You give away your money. What are you trying to pay for, Silas?" Silas froze. The question hung in the air. Heavy, piercing. It bypassed the armor he wore every day. It slipped right past the silence and struck. He looked away. He stared at the flickering flame of the oil lamp. For 3 years, nobody in Redemption Creek had asked him a real question. They took his silence as a wall, and they respected the wall. But Maddie wasn't most people. She was a woman who knew what it looked like when a person was carrying a corpse on their back. Silas swallowed. The silence stretched a minute. Then, too, Maddie didn't push. She just tied the sixth stitch. "St. Louis," Silas said. The words came out cracked, like dry earth splitting open. Maddie stopped. She kept her hands resting lightly on his arm, grounding him. She didn't speak, she just listened. 5 years ago, Silas continued, his eyes still fixed on the lamp. I was a detective. Pinkerton Agency. I was good. I saw everything. I heard everything. And I talked a lot. I thought the truth was a shield. I thought if you shined a light on the bad things, the law would sweep them up. He took a slow, shuddering breath. There was a man. A bookkeeper. Thomas. A small, nervous man. He saw a local gang boss murder, city alderman in an alley. Thomas was terrified. He was going to run. I caught him at the train station. I sat him down. I looked him in the eye just like you're looking at me. Silas' hands curled into fists on his lap. I told him the law would protect him. I gave him my word. I swore on my life that if he told the truth, he would be safe. I convinced him. Maddie dipped the rag in the warm water, gently wiping away the dried blood around the stitches. What happened? I wrote my report, Silas whispered. I went to my captain. I told him everything. I gave him the name. I gave him the location of the safe house where I hid Thomas. Silas finally looked at Maddie. His eyes were haunted, hollowed out by a guilt that had been eating him alive from the inside out for half a decade. My captain was on the gang's payroll. 2 hours later, they went to the safe house. They didn't just kill Thomas. They took their time. They left him on the steps of my boarding house. The kitchen was deathly quiet. My words killed him, Silas said. The absolute certainty in his voice was devastating. I made a promise I couldn't keep. I told the truth, and an innocent man died in agony because of it. He looked down at his freshly stitched arm. So I stopped making promises. I stopped talking. If I don't speak, I can't lie. If I don't give my word, I can't break it. I moved out here. I built a fence. I thought if I just kept my mouth shut and worked my hands to the bone, I couldn't hurt anyone else. He had finally laid it bare. The ugly, rotting thing he had carried inside him. He sat there, bracing himself for her judgment, expecting her to pity him, or worse, to tell him it wasn't his fault. Maddie didn't do either. She picked up a roll of white cotton bandage. She began to wrap his arm, firm, even pressure, binding the wound tight. "You're a fool, Silas Montgomery," Maddie said quietly. Silas blinked. Maddie tied off the bandage. She leaned back in her chair. She folded her hands in her lap and looked at him with the stern, unbroken clarity of a woman who had seen true hell and walked back out of it. "You think silence is a shield," Maddie said. Her voice was steady, rhythmic. "You think if you don't use words, you aren't responsible for the outcome. But silence isn't a shield, Silas. It's a cage, and you locked yourself inside it." "It kept Clara safe," Silas argued weakly. "Did it?" Maddie challenged. "When Sterling's men came for Elias Thorne, did your silence save him? When they came for your sister, did your silence hide her? No. You had to come banging on my door. You had to use words to beg for my help." She leaned forward. "Pain doesn't make us stronger, Silas. That is a lie men tell each other to justify their suffering." She pointed to his bandaged arm. "That cut won't make your arm stronger. It's going to leave a scar. It's going to ache when it rains. Trauma doesn't build character. It breaks us down. It makes us shrink into ourselves. It makes us afraid of the very things that make us human. Like trusting someone. Like speaking the truth." Silas stared at her, absorbing the weight of her words. "You didn't stop talking to protect other people," Maddie said, her voice softening, but losing none of its edge. "You stopped talking to protect yourself. You were afraid of failing again. You were afraid of feeling that guilt again, so you chose to feel nothing. You chose to be a ghost." Silas dropped his head. The truth in her words was a heavier blow than the knife had been. "The man who killed Thomas was your captain," Maddie continued. "The men who pulled the trigger were the gang. Your crime wasn't speaking the truth. Your tragedy was trusting a corrupt system. But you took the blame for all of it. You carried their sin." She reached across the table. For the first time, her touch wasn't clinical. She laid her warm, calloused hand over his massive, battered knuckles. "A wound needs air to heal, Silas. If you close it up dirty, it just rots underneath the skin until it poisons the whole body. The same goes for the mind." Explicit educational value continued. "Unpacking trauma requires vulnerability. Avoiding connection does not prevent pain. It only prevents healing." Maddie squeezed his hand. "Refusing to connect with people doesn't make you noble. It just makes you alone. The world is full of corrupt captains and greedy governors. The only way we survive them is by talking to each other, by warning each other, by trusting each other." Silas looked up at her hand resting on his. He slowly turned his hand over, tangling his thick fingers with hers. "You opening your mouth tonight," Maddie whispered. "You telling me the ugliest part of your life. That is the bravery that creates actual strength. Not taking a knife to the arm, not fighting drunks in the dirt. It takes a real man to bleed. It takes a stronger man to admit he is broken." Silas held her gaze. The granite in his eyes was completely gone, replaced by something warm, something alive. For 5 years he had been drowning in his own silence. Tonight, sitting in a dimly lit kitchen with a woman made of wire and iron, he finally took a breath. Thank you, squeezed her hand back. 2 words. But this time, they meant absolutely everything. Morning brought no relief. Just a sun like a hammered copper coin, baking the red dirt of Redemption Creek. The air felt thin, brittle, ready to snap. Governor Sterling had lost patience. He was done playing the polite politician. He wanted his railroad. He wanted Elias Thorn's land. And he wanted the witness who could hang him. He had pulled the leash tight on the town's corrupt officials. Sheriff Miller and Mayor Higgins were gathering men outside the saloon. A posse. Not an official one. A mob with badges pinned to their vests. They were drinking coffee, checking rifles, and looking directly at Hayes Way Station at the end of the street. Inside the way station, Silas stood at the front window. He watched the men gathering. He counted the rifles. 7 men. 2 shotguns. The math was bad. Very bad. Maddie came up beside him. She saw the mob. She didn't flinch. She just wiped her hands on her apron. "They're coming for a search," Maddie said. Her voice was flat. "They won't ask this time. They kick the door in." "I know," Silas said. The Winchester is in the back room." She did the calculus in her head, cold and precise. "We can hold the front door. We can funnel them through the choke point." Silas looked at her. He saw the iron in her spine. He saw the Civil War veteran ready to turn her home into a fortress. She was entirely willing to fight, entirely willing to die. But Silas couldn't let that happen. If guns were fired, blood would stain this floor. Maddie's blood, Clara's blood. The law would burn the way station down, and they would call it justice. Silas turned away from the window, walked to the kitchen. Clara was sitting at the table, clutching her law book. She was terrified. Silas put his heavy hand on her head, a rough, gentle weight. "Stay in the cellar," Silas told his sister. "Don't come up until Maddie tells you." Clara looked up. "What are you going to do?" Silas didn't answer. He turned and walked back to the front room. He stopped at the door. He didn't look at Maddie. He couldn't. If he looked at her, he might lose his nerve. He might decide to stay and fight side to side with her just to feel the warmth of a true partner for 1 more hour. "Lock the door behind me," Silas said. "Silas, wait," Maddie said, her brow furrowed. "What is your plan?" "I'm fixing it." He reached for the doorknob. Maddie grabbed his arm. Her grip was surprisingly strong. "We had an agreement, Silas. We don't act alone. What are you doing?" "I'm keeping the promise I made to you," he said quietly. "I'm protecting my sister, and I'm protecting you." He pulled his arm gently from her grasp. He opened the door, stepped out into the blinding sunlight, and walked down the steps. Maddie stood in the doorway. She watched him walk. He didn't walk toward the stables. He didn't try to slip out the back. He walked straight down the middle of the dusty street, right toward the saloon, right toward the mob. The street went quiet. The men with the badges stopped talking. Sheriff Miller lowered his coffee cup. Mayor Higgins swallowed hard. Silas Montgomery was a legend in this town, a man of stone. He walked with a heavy, deliberate stride. Every eye in Redemption Creek was on him. Shopkeepers stepped out onto the boardwalks. Women pulled their children back into the shadows. Silas stopped 20 yards from the posse. He stood alone in the center of the road. "Miller," Silas said. His voice wasn't a shout, but it carried. It rumbled down the street like distant thunder. Sheriff Miller puffed out his chest, stepping forward. He rested his hand on his gun belt. "Montgomery, you're blocking the road. We got official count business at the way station." "No, you don't, Silas. We're looking for a suspect connected to the Elias Thorn murder." Silas planted his boots. He took a deep breath. Then he made the move that shocked the entire town. "You're looking for Thorn's killer," Silas said. His voice echoed off the wooden storefronts. "You can stop looking. You found him." The silence that followed was absolute. Complete. A dog stopped barking in an alley. The wind seemed to die. Sheriff Miller blinked. "What did you say?" "I said I killed Elias Thorn." Silas lied. He said it with a chilling, deadpan certainty. "We had a dispute over water rights. He drew on me. I shot him. I left him in the mud." Mayor Higgins' jaw dropped. The men in the posse looked at each other, confused. This wasn't the script. Governor Sterling had told them to find a girl. Implicit educational value, absolute self-sacrifice. Silas was throwing his life away, publicly destroying his unblemished honor, to draw the legal fire entirely onto himself. By confessing, he gave the corrupt law an immediate, undeniable target. They couldn't search the way station for a suspect if the confessed killer was standing right in front of them. Sheriff Miller hesitated. Silas, you know what you're saying? I'm confessing to murder. Miller, do your job. Silas slowly unbuckled his gun belt. He let it drop to the dirt, a heavy thud. He held his empty hands out in front of him, wrists together. Miller looked around. The whole town was watching. He had a confession, a public confession. If he ignored it to go harass a widow, there would be a riot. Miller stepped forward. He pulled a pair of heavy iron shackles from his belt. His hand shook as he clamped the cold iron around Silas' thick wrists. Click, clack. The sound was sickening. Silas Montgomery, you're under arrest. Miller stammered. They led him away. Silas didn't struggle. He walked with his head high, a prisoner by choice. He walked toward the dark, windowless cellar jail beneath the courthouse. Back at the way station, Maddie stood on the porch. Her hands were gripping the wooden railing so hard her knuckles were white. Her chest heaved. She wasn't crying. She was furious. A cold, blinding fury. And went inside. She locked the door. She walked to the cellar trapdoor, pulled it open, and climbed down the wooden ladder. Clara was sitting in the gloom. I heard shouting. Did they leave? Maddie stood in the dim light. She looked at the young girl. Your brother just walked into the town square and confessed to murdering Elias Thorne, Maddie said flatly. Clara dropped her book. Her face went ashy. No, he didn't do it. I saw who did it. Why would he say that? Draw them off, Maddie said. Her voice trembled, but not from fear, from anger. To give them a body. If they have a confessed killer in custody, they have no legal right to kick down my doors looking for suspects. He shut the investigation down by putting his own neck in the noose. Clara put her hands over her mouth, a sob escaping her throat. He sacrificed himself for me. Yes, he did, Maddie said sharply. Clara looked up, shocked by Maddie's harsh tone. Aren't you grateful? He saved us. Maddie walked over and knelt in front of Clara. Her eyes were blazing. I am not grateful, Clara said, her voice a fierce whisper. I am angry, and you should be too. How can you say that? Clara cried. Because he made a choice for us, Maddie said fiercely. He decided that he was the only one strong enough to bear the cost. He decided that we were too weak to fight, so he threw himself on the grenade without asking if we were willing to hold the line together. Maddie pointed up toward the floorboards. Equality isn't just about sharing the good things, Clara. It's about sharing the burden. It is about respecting your partner enough to let them fight their own battles alongside you. Silas didn't treat me like a partner today. He treated me like a damsel in distress. He stripped me of my choice. He stole my agency to make himself the martyr. Clara wiped her tears, her breathing slowing. The words sank in. He didn't trust us to survive. Exactly, Maddie said, her voice hardening into pure resolve. He thinks his silence and his sacrifice are the only things that can save this town. He thinks the story ends with him in a cell. Maddie stood up. She smoothed her apron. The Civil War intelligence officer was back, fully awake and calculating. But he is wrong, and we are going to prove it to him. Night fell over Redemption Creek like a heavy woolen blanket. Inside the way station, the dining room was closed. The curtains were drawn tight. The oil lamps were turned low, casting long, dancing shadows against the walls. Maddie sat at the large oak table. Clara sat across from her. Between them sat an inkwell, two steel-nibbed pens, a stack of heavy parchment, and Clara's law book. Maddie wasn't pacing. She wasn't wringing her hands over Silas sitting in a dark, rat-infested cell. Pity was useless. Action was required. Read the statute again, Clara, Maddie ordered. Clara ran her finger down the yellowed page. Her voice was steady now. The tears were gone. Texas Penal Code, Section 4. Conspiracy to defraud the state of land resulting in capital murder. It falls under federal jurisdiction if the land is part of the National Railway Expansion Corridor. Good, Maddie said. She dipped her pen in the ink. That means Governor Sterling's local judges can't touch it. If we can get this out of the county, his money means nothing. Implicit educational value. Women taking charge of their own fate. They are not waiting for a man to rescue them. They are using intellect, literacy, and an understanding of the system to dismantle a corrupt power structure. The pen and the law book are their weapons. Maddie began to write. Her handwriting was elegant, fast, and ruthlessly precise. She didn't write emotional pleas. She wrote intelligence reports. She detailed dates, times, names. She laid out the timeline of Elias Thorne's murder. Copy the execution order, Maddie instructed. Word for exact word. Draw the governor's seal as best you can at the top. We need 3 copies. Clara pulled a fresh sheet of paper and began to copy Sterling's damning, handwritten note. Where are we sending them? Clara asked, her pen scratching against the paper. 1 to the Supreme Court in Austin, Maddie said. 1 to the Federal Marshal's office in Houston. And 1 to a reporter I know at the Telegraph. A man who owes me his life from a field hospital in '64. He hates politicians more than he hates the devil. They worked for 3 hours, silent, focused, relentless. When the ink was dry, Maddie folded the letters. slipped the copied evidence inside, and sealed the envelopes with red wax. She walked to the back door and slipped out into the dark. She walked to the livery stable. Old Amos, the town handyman, was sleeping on a pile of hay. He was a black man in his 60s, quiet, invisible to men like Sterling and Miller. But Maddie saw him. She knew he was sharp, and she knew he owed Silas his livelihood. Maddie woke him gently. She handed him the 3 envelopes and a pouch of coins.
Take the roan horse, Maddie whispered. Ride to the next county, put these on the morning train.
Pay the conductor directly to hand-deliver them. Do not get seen leaving town. Amos looked at the seals. He looked at Maddie. He nodded once. For Silas, for all of us, Maddie corrected. She walked back to the way station. She slept for 2 hours in a chair by the door. When the sun broke the horizon, Maddie Hayes stood up. She washed her face. She put on her best dress, a simple dark blue cotton dress, no apron. She picked up Clara S. heavy leather law book. She walked out the front door. She didn't sneak, tracing the exact path Silas had taken the day before. Her spine was straight. Her chin was up. She walked into the sheriff's office. Sheriff Miller was sitting with his boots up on his desk, drinking coffee. Mayor Higgins was nervously pacing by the window. When Maddie walked in, Miller scrambled to take his boots off the desk. He cleared his throat. Mrs. Hayes, we're closed for public business. I am not the public, Miller. I am a citizen demanding an audience, Maddie said. She walked to his desk. She didn't ask for a chair. She slammed the heavy law book down onto the wood. The sound made Higgins jump. I want Silas Montgomery released, Maddie said. Miller let out a nervous laugh. Released? Maddie, the man confessed to murder in front of 50 people. He lied to protect a witness, Maddie said smoothly. You can't prove that. I don't have to, Maddie replied. She rested her hands on the book. Because as of 4 o'clock this morning, sworn affidavits detailing Elias Thorne as true killers along with a copy of Governor Sterling's handwritten execution order are on a train headed for the federal marshal in Houston and the press. The color completely drained from Mayor Higgins' face. He grabbed the edge of a chair to steady himself.
You're bluffing.
I survived a war, Higgins. I don't bluff, Maddie said. Her eyes were ice. Governor Sterling is going to fall. When the marshals arrive, they are going to look for co-conspirators. They are going to look at the mayor who allowed it and the sheriff who locked up an innocent man to cover it up. Miller swallowed hard. A bead of sweat rolled down his temple. Silas confessed. Silas gave you an excuse. Maddie interrupted, her voice ringing with authority. But an excuse doesn't buy you innocence, Sheriff. You know he didn't shoot Thorne. You know Sterling is stealing this valley. She leaned over the desk, invading Miller's space. You might lock Silas up today because of the power of that tin badge on your chest. You might think hiding behind the governor's money keeps you safe. But tomorrow, when the federal court knocks on this door, that badge won't buy your freedom. She tapped the law book. The law only works when men have the spine to uphold it. Injustice only wins when decent people choose to stay silent. You are choosing silence, Miller. And when the hammer falls, it's going to crush you right alongside Sterling. Miller looked at the law book. He looked at the mayor, who was practically trembling. Then he looked at the cellar door across the room. If I let him go, Miller stammered, Sterling will ruin me. Sterling is already ruined, Maddie said. I am giving you a choice, Sheriff. You can go down with a corrupt politician, or you can unlock that door right now and stand on the right side of history. Choose. The room was agonizingly quiet. The ticking of the wall clock sounded like hammer blows. Miller's hands shook. He looked at Maddie's unwavering eyes. He realized he wasn't dealing with a grieving widow. He was dealing with a general who had already won the war. Slowly, Miller reached into his desk drawer. He pulled out a heavy iron ring of keys. He didn't say a word. He stood up, walked past Maddie, and headed for the cellar door. Maddie stood tall. She didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She just picked up her book. Waiting for the heavy iron door to open, she had fought her battle with a pen and the truth, and she'd had won. The heavy iron door of the cellar groaned on its hinges. It sounded like an adult waking up with bad joints. Sheriff Miller pulled the door wide. He stepped back. He didn't look down into the dark. He couldn't. Maddie stood at the top of the wooden stairs. She waited. A moment later, a boot hit the bottom step. Then another. Silas Montgomery walked up into the light. He smelled of damp earth and rust. His clothes were rumpled. His wrists were bruised purple where the heavy iron shackles had bitten into his skin. But his back was straight. His chin was up. He stopped at the top of the stairs. He looked at Miller. Then he looked at Maddie. He saw the law book tucked under her arm. He saw the cold, undisputed victory in her eyes. He didn't know exactly what she had done, but he knew she had fought a war while he was sitting in the dark, and she had won. You're free to go, Silas, Miller mumbled. He wiped his sweating forehead with a dirty handkerchief. There was a misunderstanding. Silas didn't say a word to the sheriff. He looked at Maddie. Come on, Maddie said. Coffee is getting cold. They walked out of the sheriff's office together. They walked down the center of the street. Town watched them, the same shopkeepers, the same quiet folks who had watched quiet folks Silas surrender yesterday. Now, the fear was gone. 2 days later, the storm finally broke. But it wasn't rain that washed into Redemption Creek. It was the federal government. The morning train brought 3 U.S. Marshals from Houston. They didn't wear shiny tin stars. They wore long coats and carried federal warrants. Maddie's letters had hit their desks like sticks of dynamite. Governor Sterling tried to leave town quietly in his velvet-seated carriage. The marshals stopped him at the county line. They didn't care about his tailored suit or his smooth voice. They put him in chains. They arrested Mayor Higgins before noon. Sheriff Miller turned in his badge and locked himself in his own house, waiting for the inevitable knock on his door. The hounds scattered. The town breathed. That evening, the way station was quiet. Clara was in the kitchen, finally humming a tune while she washed the dishes. The heavy dread that had choked her for weeks was gone. Maddie was sweeping the front porch. The sun was dipping low, painting the Texas sky in bruised purples and burnt oranges. A shadow fell across the steps. It was old Amos, the livery stableman. He stood with his battered hat in his hands. He looked nervous. Evening, Amos, Maddie said, leaning on her broom. You rode hard the other night. I'm obliged to you. Wasn't doing it for thanks, ma'am, Amos said quietly. He looked around, making sure they were alone. He reached into his worn overalls. He pulled out a small leather-bound ledger. It looked old, water-stained. He held it out to her. What's this? Maddie asked, taking it. He gave it to me a year ago, told me to hide it. Told me if anything ever happened to him, if he got sick or got shot, or just didn't come back one day, I was to give it to you, Maddie frowned. Why me? Amos shrugged his tired shoulders. He said you were the only person in this town who wouldn't try to make a statue out of him. He said you'd know what to do with it. Amos tipped his head and walked away into the dusk. Maddie sat down on the wooden bench. She opened the ledger. It wasn't a diary, it was a ledger of accounts, but it wasn't keeping track of the Montgomery Ranch. Maddie ran her finger down the first page. October 1875, paid $40 to the county clerk. Anonymous, cleared the back taxes on the Jenkins farm so the widow wouldn't be evicted. She turned the page. March 1876, bought the deed to the south pasture from the bank, $120. Transferred title to Amos, kept my name off the paper. No man should die a tenant on the land he bled for. Maddie kept reading, page after page. For 3 years, Silas had lived like a pauper. He wore patched shirts. He drove a battered wagon. The town thought he was a miser. They thought he was hoarding his money out at that lonely ranch. He hadn't kept a dime. Every cent he made, he funneled quietly into the town. He bought school books for the children. He paid the doctor S-tabs for the sick. He fixed roofs in the dead of night. He stepped in where the law failed, where charity fell short, and he did it completely in the shadows. Implicit educational value, true compassion is entirely devoid of ego. It does not seek a stage. Silas used his strength and his wealth to quietly dismantle the barriers of race and class in his community. He didn't want gratitude. He just wanted the world to be slightly less cruel. Maddie closed the book. The leather felt heavy in her hands. She understood him now. The silence wasn't just a cage, it was a penance. He was trying to buy back the soul he felt he lost in St. Louis. He was trying to prove to himself that his actions could save people, even if his words had once killed a man. Maddie stood up. She walked around to the back of the way station. Silas was there. Of course he was. He was replacing a cracked hinge on the barn door, always working, always fixing broken things. Maddie walked up behind him. She tossed the leather ledger onto the chopping block. It hit the wood with a heavy smack. Silas stopped. He looked at the book. Then he looked at Maddie. The muscles in his jaw tightened. Amos talks too much, Silas murmured. Amos is a good man, Maddie corrected. And you are a fraud, Silas Montgomery. Silas put his hammer down. He wiped his hands on a rag. He didn't defend himself. You let this whole town think you were a cold, heartless rock, Maddie said. She stepped closer. You let them think you didn't care if they lived or died. Meanwhile, you were keeping half of them from starving. They didn't need to know it was me, Silas said, looking at the dirt. If they knew, they'd feel like they owed me. A man shouldn't have to carry a debt just because he hit a patch of hard luck. You're right, Maddie said softly, but you missed the point. She stepped right into his space. She forced him to look up, to look her in the eye. I was so angry with you yesterday, Maddie said, her voice steady and clear. When you walked out there and confessed to murder, I was furious. I was protecting you, Silas said, his brow furrowing. I drew the fire. And you took away my choice, Maddie countered sharply. You took away Clara's choice. You decided that we were too fragile to face the consequences, so you threw yourself on the sword. You treated us like property to be guarded, not like partners in a fight. Silas blinked. He hadn't seen it that way. He only saw the danger. A true partnership isn't about one person carrying all the weight, Maddie explained. She tapped him firmly on the chest. Equality means we share the good and we share the bad. You respect someone by letting them stand beside you when the bullets fly. You don't respect them by locking them in a safe room and dying on the front porch. Silas absorbed the words. They cut deep, deeper than the knife wound on his arm. I thought I was doing the right thing, he whispered. You were doing the brave thing, Maddie corrected. But bravery without trust is just arrogance. You didn't trust me to handle Sheriff Miller. You didn't trust my mind. You only trusted your own sacrifice. She reached out and picked up the ledger. She held it up between them. You do this too, she said gently. You fix the town in secret because you don't trust them to love you for it. You think if you just give and give and give, you can balance the scales for what happened in St. Louis. But you can't, Silas. You can't buy your redemption in the dark. Silas let out a long, ragged breath. The walls he had built for 5 years were crumbling. Not because they were being battered down, but because Maddie was systemic man with the truth. I showed him how to do it any other way, Silas admitted. The raw honesty in his voice was breaking. You start by asking, Maddie said. She took a step back. She crossed her arms. You start by looking at me right now and asking me what I want. Not assuming. Not deciding for me. Ask me. Silas looked at her. He saw the fire in her eyes, the unyielding strength. He saw the woman who had stared down a knife, stared down a corrupt sheriff, and swallowed hard. He found stormed his voice. Maddie, said his voice low and trembling, will you let me stay? Not as a guard, not to pay a debt. Just stay. Maddie smiled, a real, genuine smile that reached all the way to her eyes. It was a beautiful thing to see. Yes, Maddie said, I will. She didn't run to him. She didn't throw her arms around his neck. That wasn't who they were. They were two adults, scarred and weathered, who had simply decided to stop fighting the storm alone. Silas reached out. He took her hand, his rough, calloused fingers intertwined with hers. A quiet promise, a shared weight. They stood there as the sun finally sank below the Texas horizon, leaving the world bathed in the quiet, peaceful twilight. Winter came to Redemption Creek. It brought frost that painted the cedar fences white and turned the red dirt hard as iron. But the town wasn't dying anymore. With Governor Sterling sitting in a federal penitentiary awaiting trial, the corrupt land deals were reversed. Elias Thorne's farm was given back to his estranged brother. The railroad company, desperate to clean up its public image, announced it would build a spur through the valley after all. Legally this time, money flowed back in. But this time, it was honest money. Inside Hayes' way station, the cast iron stove roared. The dining room was full of paying customers. Travelers, surveyors, honest men. Montgomery sat at the corner table. She wasn't scrubbing floors. She wasn't hiding. She was wearing a crisp, tailored wool dress. In her hands, she held a letter. The seal on the envelope was broken. The heavy cream-colored paper inside bore the crest of the Texas State University College of Law in Austin. Maddie walked over, wiping her hands on a clean apron. She carried 2 mugs of hot cider. She set one down in front of Clara. Well, Maddie asked. Clara looked up. Her eyes were bright, shining with tears, but not the kind she cried in the storm 3 months ago. I got in, Clara whispered. She pushed the letter across the table. Maddie read it. It was an official acceptance. But there was a handwritten note at the bottom from the Dean of Admissions. Miss Montgomery, your sworn affidavit regarding the events in Redemption Creek was the most articulate, fiercely argued piece of legal writing I have read this year. We look forward to having a mind like yours in our halls. You leave on Tuesday, Maddie said, handing the letter back. She smiled proudly. You're going to give those old professors hell, Clara? I learned from the best, Clara said, smiling back. The front door opened. A gust of cold wind blew in, carrying Silas. He stamped the snow off his boots. He hung his hat on the peg. He walked over to the table. He looked at the letter in Clara's hands. Austin, Silas asked. Austin, Clara confirmed, beaming. Silas reached down and pulled his younger sister into a tight, fierce hug. It wasn't the protective, desperate grip from the night of the storm. It was a hug of celebration, of letting go. I'm proud of you, Silas said, his voice thick. He pulled back. He looked at Maddie. Reverend is here. He sat back by the fire. Maddie nodded. She untied her apron. She draped it over the back of the chair. She was wearing her dark blue cotton dress. She hadn't bought a white gown. She hadn't ordered a veil from Houston. There were no flowers. There was no grand choir. She walked to the back door with Silas. They stepped out onto the rear porch. The cold air bit at their cheeks. In the center of the yard, near the chopping block, a large bonfire was crackling. Reverend Thomas stood near the flames, holding a small, worn Bible. Old Amos stood beside him, grinning from ear to ear. A few of the townspeople, the honest ones, the ones Silas had quietly helped over the years, stood in a loose half-circle. It was a simple gathering, stripped to the bone, real. Maddie and Silas walked up to the fire. They stood side by side, not facing each other, facing the world together. The Reverend opened his book. He cleared his throat. "We are gathered here in the cold to witness something warm," the Reverend began. He looked at the two of them. He knew their history. He knew the scars they carried. Marriage ain't a magic spell. It doesn't erase the past, but it is a promise about the future. It says a promise that when the storms come, and they will come, you don't have to bolt the door alone. He looked at Silas. "Silas Montgomery, do you take this woman?" Silas turned his head. He looked at Maddie. The firelight danced in her eyes. He didn't look at the Reverend. He spoke directly to her. "I choose you," Silas said. His voice was a steady, unbreakable rumble. "And I choose the truth. No more hiding. Not my sister. Not my past. Not my heart." He didn't offer out and took her hand, his thumb tracing the faint scar on her palm where the halter rope had burned her months ago. The Reverend smiled and looked at Maddie. "Martha Hayes, do you take this man?" Maddie squeezed Silas' hand. "I take him as he is," Maddie said clearly. "Not as a savior, not as a ghost, but as my partner, in the light and in the dark." "Then by the grace of God, you're Hottenman," Reverend said, closing the book. "That enough?" "It's more than enough," Maddie smiled. There was no grand kiss for the audience. Silas simply lifted her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles. A gesture of absolute, profound respect. Tuesday morning came fast. The stagecoach for Austin was idling in front of the way station. The horses blew plumes of white steam into the freezing air. Silas was loading Clara's leather trunk onto the roof of the coach. Clara stood on the porch with Maddie. She was wearing a heavy winter coat, her law book tucked safely into her satchel. She looked terrified again. But this time, it was the good kind of terror, the terror of a big world waiting to be conquered. "I don't know if I'm ready," Clara whispered, looking at the horses. "What if I get there and I'm not smart enough? What if they look at me and just see a frightened girl from the dirt?" Maddie reached out and grabbed Clara by the shoulders. She squared the girl up, forcing her to look straight into her eyes. "Listen to me, Clara Montgomery," Maddie said firmly. "The world is full of men in fine suits who are going to try to tell you who you are. They are going to try to define you by your gender, by your age, and by where you came from." Clara swallowed hard, nodding. "Do not let them," Maddie commanded. "This world isn't saved by heroes riding white horses. It isn't saved by men with guns or politicians with money. It's saved by ordinary people who decide not to close their eyes to evil. It is saved by people who read the law and demand that it applies to everyone." She gave Clara a gentle, firm shake. "The strength of a human being doesn't lie in how loud they can shout or how much money they have in the bank. True strength is refusing to let your dignity be broken. When they try to push you down, you stand up. When they tell you to be quiet, you speak louder with the truth. You owe them nothing, Clara. You owe yourself everything." Clara's shoulders straightened. The fear in her eyes melted away, replaced by the same fierce iron she had watched Maddie forge over the last 3 months. "I will," Clara said. She threw her arms around Maddie. It was a tight, desperate hug of immense gratitude. Maddie hugged her back, resting her chin on the girl's shoulder. Go, give 'em," Maddie whispered. Clara pulled away, smiling. She walked down the steps. Silas helped her into the carriage. He didn't say much. He just kissed her forehead and tapped the side of the coach. The driver cracked the whip. The horses surged forward. Maddie and Silas stood on the wooden porch of the way station. They watched the stagecoach roll down the dirt road, shrinking into the distance, carrying the future away to do great things. The town of Redemption Creek was waking up around them. Hammers rang out. Wagons rolled. Life was moving forward. Silas reached out. His hand found Maddie's. Their fingers locked together automatically, seamlessly. "Roof on the barn still needs patching before the snow hits," Silas said, looking at the sky. "Then we better get to work," Maddie replied. They turned away from the road and walked back inside the way station together. Two ordinary people, scarred but unbroken, ready to face whatever the world had left to throw at them. This story is a work of fiction created purely for entertainment purposes. Any names, characters, events, locations, or situations portrayed in this narrative are either the product of the author's imagination or used fictitiously, and any resemblance to real persons, living or dead, is entirely coincidental.
And so the stagecoach rolls away down that red dirt road, carrying Clara Montgomery toward a future she nearly didn't live to see. And Maddie and Silas turn back inside, hand in hand, to patch a roof before the snow hits. No fanfare, no grand parade, just two people, choosing each other and choosing the work, one ordinary morning at a time. That is the whole truth of this story, and it is worth sitting with. Because Redemption Creek was a town that was dying, not from drought, not from disease, but from something far more dangerous, from the quiet surrender of decent people to corrupt power, From the slow, suffocating choice to look away, to stay silent, to decide that the powerful always win and the rest of us are just waiting for the verdict. A town doesn't die from one dramatic moment of evil. It dies from 1,000 small moments of cowardice, and it is reborn, not by a hero, but by an ordinary woman who refuses to close her door in a storm. Maddie Hayes teaches us something that this world desperately needs to hear right now. She teaches us that dignity is not a reward for the strong. It is not something you earn when conditions are favorable, or when the law is on your side, or when the odds are in your favor. Dignity is a daily, deliberate, radical choice. It is the choice Maddie made every single time she looked poverty in the face and refused to be humiliated by it. Every time she stood behind her counter and didn't flinch. Every time she said, not with flowers or speeches, but with iron in her spine, "I am worth exactly as much as any person who walks through that door." And Silas Montgomery, this silent, haunted, beautiful contradiction of a man, teaches us something just as important, and perhaps even harder to accept. He teaches us that the things we do in secret to punish ourselves are not penance. They are prisons. He spent 5 years buying back a soul he never actually lost. He poured his entire life into the shadows, fixing the broken world quietly, because he was too afraid to stand in the light and be seen. He had confused sacrifice with atonement. He had mistaken silence for safety, and Maddie had to look him dead in the eye and tell him the truth, that you cannot love people well from behind a wall. That true partnership means letting someone stand beside you in the fire, not locking them away from it. That asking for what you need is not weakness. It is the only honest thing left. This story also gives us Clara, and Clara may be the most important person in it, because Clara is the seed. She is what happens when the people around you refuse to let your trauma become your identity. She walked into that way station as a terrified girl clutching a bloody piece of paper, and she walked out of it on a stagecoach to law school, because 2 people chose to treat her not as a victim to be sheltered, but as a mind to be equipped. They didn't hide her from the truth of the law. They handed her the book and said, "Learn how to use this." They didn't protect her from the danger. They taught her how to face it, and in doing so, they didn't just save one life. They planted something that would grow and spread and shelter others for generations to come. This story is ultimately about what it truly means to build something that lasts. Not a building, not a ranch, not even a marriage. It is about building the kind of character that doesn't crack when power comes knocking. It is about the quiet, unglamorous, absolutely essential work of being a decent human being when decency is the most dangerous and expensive thing you can offer. The strongest walls in Redemption Creek were not built from stone or iron. They were built from honesty, from trust, from the radical, revolutionary act of treating every person, regardless of their gender, their race, their wealth, or their past, as someone whose life has inherent and irreplaceable worth. Governor Sterling lost. Not because the law is always just, or because good always triumphs in a fair fight. He lost because 2 stubborn, scarred, extraordinarily ordinary people simply refused to let him win. They didn't outgun him. They outlasted him. They outthought him. And they did it together. That is the lesson of Redemption Creek. The world is not saved by extraordinary people in extraordinary moments. It is saved by ordinary people who refuse, again and again and again, to look the other way.